going to ask you how you read the current situation. There's a lot of people out there, understandably afraid. Here we are in 2022, and we're looking at an invasion of Russia into our European borders. It's a pretty frightening time. What should we understand about the build-up of over 100,000 troops at the Russian-Ukrainian border?
It's a terrifying time. First, it won't be an invasion, it'll be a further invasion. Russia invaded Ukraine almost 8 years ago, and to this day holds over 7% of Ukrainian land illegally in the Donbass and Crimea, has killed over 14,000 Ukrainians, injured tens of thousands, some horribly, and driven 2.5 million from their homes. So it's a further invasion. Look, I was speaking to a close friend out in Kiev this morning, and it's pretty terrifying. People are, initially they were very, very calm. I think people are starting to feel a lot more worried and concerned at the moment. They're an incredibly resilient people. They will fight. Up to 30% of the country has said they will take up arms. That's like 12 or 13 million people.
Can I just stop you there? I also am a Russianist. I speak and read and write in Russian and following this very, very closely. There seems to be peculiar mixed messages. Nobody quite understands what the international chess game here is. And I wonder if I've read it correctly. The demands seemingly of Vladimir Putin, expressed through his foreign minister Lavrov, is that that Ukraine does not, in effect, join NATO or any other of the European, significant organisation. In other words, it doesn't ally itself any further with the EU. And that seems to be their fundamental bottom line. That happens and they won't invade. At the same time, you had the other day the Ukrainian Prime Minister saying, as far as he's concerned, there's no imminent invasion. And then you get the American President saying that there is. First of all, going to Russia, is that right? Have I read the chess game right? Is that their bottom line demand? And if so, for people to understand, why can't Ukraine simply say, well, we won't join in the immediate term NATO? And won't that solve the problem? Or is that not just capitulation, but, frankly, a bit of the Neville Chamberlains?
Yeah. Look, if that's your reading of the situation, I think it's exactly the reading the Russians would like you to have.
Okay.
The whole NATO membership is a smokescreen, or as our Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, set out very clearly almost 2 weeks ago in an op-ed in the Times, it's a straw man. I was speaking to Katerina Yushchenko this morning, who's the wife of Viktor Yushchenko, who the Russians tried to poison in 2005 when he was running for the presidency. That was, Katerina would say, that was the first shot which Russia fired against Ukraine. Russia is not worried about Ukraine joining NATO. NATO is a defensive alliance, as you and I know, and hopefully all the listeners know. NATO is never going to invade Russia. Putin and his henchmen in the Kremlin fear one thing and one thing only, and that is a free, democratic, successful Ukraine on his doorstep. That is a threat. That is a huge threat to their, and fuel to the fire to their own democratic and democracy movement at home in Russia, which is currently suppressed very, very brutally. But Putin has said that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. He has made it very, very clear that he wants to put what friends of mine in Ukraine call Soviet Union 2.0, or the Russian Empire, back together. Ukraine was the jewel in the crown. They had 40% of the industrial output of the entire Soviet Union, despite being just one of 15 Soviet republics. So I really think that that's it. And there's lots of people, certainly on the Ukrainian side, would agree with me. What Putin really fears is a successful Ukraine. He will do everything to retard Ukraine's progress to the West and towards democracy and fighting corruption.
To what extent do you think we've already appeased too much? You started what you were explaining to us before, which many of us have been watching for some time, perhaps with our head in our hands, when there was an incursion, use that language on purpose, into Sevastopol and into the Crimea. we, the West, effectively demonstrating our weakness, did absolutely nothing. There are echoes of history as you think back to perhaps Hitler invading the Sudetenland. We failed as a Western alliance, NATO or anyone else for that matter, to stop Russia at that point, deploying pretty, I have to say, weak a response in the form of sanctions. The fact that we haven't stood up to Putin so far, doesn't that demonstrate to him that we are not a meaningful, strong alliance moving forward? And so the reality is, just as the slip of the tongue that President Biden gave in the course of his long press conference demonstrates, we are no longer a strong, coherent Western power that has the capacity, the will, to do anything other than, frankly, appease Putin in any event. He knows that, and he's exploiting that weakness. Isn't that right?
I think you're absolutely right, certainly in the past. Remember, there was an agreement called the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. The Budapest Memorandum was drawn up when Ukraine decided to give up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. The Budapest Memorandum was originally signed by Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, guaranteeing Ukraine's territorial integrity. It was later signed up to by China and France. Now, you could say that the West sat on its hands, and obviously Russia violated that memorandum, that agreement completely. But, you know, the minister, Pavlo Klimkin, who I worked for, always loved to quote the great British leader, Winston Churchill, who said, "Appeasers are ones who feed crocodiles, hoping that they will be the ones to be eaten last." There is no doubt, in my view, there is no doubt that we have appeased Putin in the past. Anybody, and people far, far more experienced than me, anybody who is experienced in dealing with Russia will tell you, you can only deal with Russia from a position of power and strength.
Well, some would argue, and I think successfully, as a brilliant speech people should watch, Thatcher giving a speech to a joint session of Congress, I think it's in 1985, and she says, "Be in no doubt, it's our strength that have brought the Soviets to the negotiation table." And looking at what brought an end to the Cold War, that does seem like a persuasive point of view. Cormac Smith, before we get to the big question, which is Putin's endgame here, you know, there is another point of view, a historical one, which is to say that if you look at the regions of the Ukraine that Russia has re-annexed, a good deal of that was in Russian hands and part of Russian territory, certainly before the Second World War, and that it's always formed part of Russia's nation state in the same way that sort of Wales does. And that's certainly a powerful argument that Russia makes. Do you think it's a persuasive one?
I don't think it's a persuasive argument, and the reason is in 1991, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was a referendum in Ukraine, and 92% of the Ukrainian people voted for independence from Russia, and that was in every single oblast, every single region, Crimea being one, Donbass, Luhansk, Donetsk being others. There is absolutely no evidence to suggest that there is a majority in any region that would support reintegration with Russia. In fact, if anything, and in particular, since the Maidan revolution in 2013, 2014, there's a lot of evidence to show that Ukraine has moved even further to the West, with a far, far greater proportion of Ukrainian people supporting the aspiration of membership to both NATO and the European Union.
It's a difficult thing to understand, other than they're sort of Russian, Slavic speaking. You know, Russia has borders with, say, Finland, for instance, which is about as democratic a country as you will ever find.
Yeah.
And so, much as one can understand strategically Putin's mind invading Sevastopol and the Crimea, it's a hot water port, it's very important for them strategically. This sort of argument that it's bad for Russia to have borders with Western liberal democracies is sort of hard to sort of understand. So to help us understand it, what is Putin's endgame?
Well, I'll go back to where I started. Putin's endgame is he wants to retard Ukraine's progress to the West. He wants to retard Ukraine's progress to full democracy, and also Ukraine is a young state and they're dealing with lots and lots of issues, but they're making real progress. And I saw that at the time that I was working there and in the time since I have come away. Furthermore, he clearly wants to bring Ukraine back into the Russian orbit. He wants to reestablish a sphere of influence for Russia. And I think the basic thing that we could say to that is, I go back to the democratic will of the Ukrainian people. I mentioned my friend Katerina. Well, Katerina in Kiev has every bit as much right to live in democratic freedom as has Linda in London or indeed Derval in Dublin. Spheres of influence do not hold sway anymore. And we have moved on from that era. And the democratic will of 42 million Ukrainian people, to me, that's what trumps the argument.
Lastly, a lot of people will think about this as a people we know little about, to use language that has been used in the past, for people that we shouldn't necessarily care about. You put it in very persuasive terms there. As we look at the threat, and as there's a possibility, bearing in mind we supply at least some of the troops to NATO, which means some of our soldiers from our communities are at risk, why should we care about this, and why should we show solidarity with the Ukrainian people and with the Ukrainian government?
Quite simply because, Putin will not stop at Ukraine in terms of what he wants to do in terms of extending his influence over other countries. Putin has not just been waging a low-level war on Ukraine for the last 8 years, he's been waging a hybrid war on Europe. And about hybrid war we don't really often understand enough about, but it includes assassinations and assassination attempts, as we had in Salisbury in the UK in 2018. Indeed, I worked very closely with our government on that. It involves meddling in elections. It involves cyber attacks. It involves massive disinformation spewed out by channels like RT and Sputnik, and troll factories with thousands of keyboard jockeys outside St. Petersburg and Moscow, with the fundamental aim of sowing division in the West. So I think Ukraine's freedom is very, very important.
You would say, in effect, Ukraine's freedom is ours. Now, I said lastly, but it is important. There'll be a lot of people listening to this that are afraid that this is the beginning, the slippery slope into a European war. And you look at the ways in which the First and Second World War began, and it doesn't look dissimilar from this sort of tension. Can you give some comfort to our listeners that can be stopped?
I wish I could. I can't. And there's wiser men than me that cannot actually, in all honesty, give that comfort. What I can say, and what we do have to remember, is that we are, there is absolutely no intention to put British boots on the ground of Ukraine. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. What we are doing is we are arming the Ukrainians. But the Ukrainians don't expect us or other NATO allies to put boots on the ground. I listened to their defense minister before Christmas saying, look, give us the weapons we need. We will do our own fighting. Britain is currently in Kiev and in parts of Ukraine is considered Ukraine's best friend. They were when I was out there between 2016 and 18. I was out before Christmas visiting old friends and colleagues. And I sat around a table with about 7 or 8 senior diplomats who I had worked with. And I said, look, guys, privately, because I'm not a diplomat anymore, you can speak completely openly with me. I said, are the Brits still your best friends? And there was no hesitation. I've been hearing stories in the last week or two of God Save the Queen being played around Kiev and around different parts of Ukraine. And in fact, not only has Britain been flying out tons and tons and tons of the exact type of defensive anti-armor light weaponry that they need to defend themselves and have asked for, but I think Britain has played a very, very significant role in leading the international effort and marshalling, along with the Americans, it's got to be said, despite the missteps which President Biden made. The Americans actually have been along with ourselves, have been the firmest, and the Canadians, it's got to be said as well. But I think there's a very good case for saying that the strong stance that Britain has taken has been responsible for encouraging a lot of other European nations, in particular in the last 7 to 10 days, to start getting on board and supplying defensive weapons to Ukraine as well.
Well, Cormac Smith, clear and helpful and informed, former communications advisor to the Foreign Minister of Ukraine. I have to say, listening to that has changed my mind, and in this regard, I did think the response of us and our European allies was weak, but making a case as he did so powerfully as to why we should show solidarity with our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. I have to say that case is made about as powerfully as it could be by Cormac Smith. What's your view? Do you think Russia has a right to the Ukraine? Perhaps you do. You know the number. It's 0344 499 1000, or get in touch via the website at talkradio.co.uk, or text the word talk and your message to 87222. I'm Rob Rinder. It's now time to break for travel.